CG reconstructions of historical buildings, whether still standing or turned into ruins over time, either aimed at fidelity or being a paid homage to wonders of the past, do stand as a significant challenge for 3D artists. In this context, superimposed reconstructions are even more of a daunting experience, a time machine where past and present need to coexist together at the same time in the same space. Chances of success depends upon finding the right subject and reference, and will require familiarity with perspective and measurement systems, while making the most out of one's modeling and texturing skills, all the way up to the final compositing stage. But how do we define what a good potential subject is? For this, my eyes would naturally turn toward my hometown, Rome, and hence to the Roman Forum. The perfect candidate would satisfy three conditions. Its remains would need to be standing in their original location and position as much as possible, and they would need to be part of a relevant portion of the original building, since the vast majority of pictures and references are of course going to be framed around that. Finally, the presence of reliable sources would be essential to allow for a reasonably accurate reconstruction. In my quest, after evaluating different options, I eventually turned to the southern part of the forum, where three Corinthian columns along with a piece of entablature are standing on top of a massive arcaded podium. These are the remains of the temple of Castor and Pollux, and here is where I would finally set. Indeed, the site is pretty much clean from alterations, and the original structures are in a quite decent state of preservation. A Roman temple named after Greek gods. The myth of its very own foundation traces back to the 5th century BC and a war between the last king of Rome and the newborn Roman Republic, where the twin gods are said to have appeared on the battlefield in aid of the latter. As many other buildings of the past, it underwent a few reconstructions. Rebuilt and enlarged in the year 117 BC, was restored again in 73 BC. Destroyed by a fire a few years later, was finally rebuilt by Emperor Tiberius in the year 6 AD, and this last stage, known as that of the Augustan Temple, is what remains today and what this reconstruction would be focused on. At its peak, the temple would have appeared as a truly magnificent one, a 7 meters tall double podium with chambers, also called taberne or loculi, placed in between each column and supposedly used by the office for weights and measures, which was hosted in this very same temple to conduct its business. The access to the temple was possible through lateral flights of stairs, still visible nowadays. On top of the podium, 38 Corinthian columns of the finest quality, all of them surmounted by a richly decorated entablature. For this superimposition, I relied on two main sources. One is the Architectural Antiquities of Rome by George Ledwell Taylor, which contains descriptions and beautiful hand-drawn plates about many of the buildings belonging to the Roman tradition, while the other is coming from the occasional papers of the Nordic Institute in Rome, which is specific to the temple of Castor and Pollux and in particular to its Augustan phase, and contains hypotheses of reconstructions, but most importantly, on-site precise measures for the many different parts. Along with the right subject, a good base image is of course needed as well, and again, three are the conditions I set. The shot will need to have a decent resolution and to frame as much as possible of the whole structure. More importantly, light conditions will need to be as neutral as possible to potentially minimize pre- and post-processing editing. The one I would eventually choose is this pin by Rebecca Campanaro, and I don't really know if it's her shot or not, but anyway, that's the source I used. The original image is 3024 by 4032, which is not that much, but actually among the best resolutions I could find. Details appear to be quite washed out, but the thing that drew my attention to this shot in particular is the nice overcast weather that would make lighting a bit easier to manage throughout the whole process. To analyze the base image's perspective and scale, I use FSPy, which I'm sure many of you already know of. You're going to need both the standalone version and the Blender add-on. In the first, you can simply load the reference image and start looking for vanishing points. Now, this is not the usual simple room with clear defined lines, so I knew I needed to work with some assumptions and a bit of a tolerance. To define the vanishing point on the x-axis, I used the base of the podium and the lower edge of the entablature as references, while for the y-axis I leveraged on the fact that apparently the front of the temple was intended to be aligned to the facade of the near Basilica Julia. For the z-axis, whatever reference is okay, as long as it is perpendicular to the terrain. The position of the gizmo within SPy will correspond to the origin point in Blender once the project is imported, and it is usually good practice to place it at the floor level. However, since I needed to retrieve the real-world scale of the image and that the only measure which can be assessed from the image is that of the column, which I knew was approximately around 14.8 meters tall, I had to place it at the base of the columns, which means that I would then need to work my way to the ground in a different way. Speaking of measurements, the unit adopted is the original Roman foot, where 1 foot is equal to 29.64 centimeters and 12 inches would amount to that 1 foot. Based on this, I could for instance determine the podium to be 23 feet tall or 6.82 meters and the column to be exactly 50 feet tall or 14.82 meters. At this stage, my aim was to validate the perspective and measures coming from what I just did in SPy. Back into Blender, the first step was to recreate the plane upon which the columns are standing, and from there, and based on the height of the podium, try to extrude down to meet the line of the ground, which apparently did not happen. And that's due to the fact that from the base of the podium up to the base of the column, the podium itself is actually sloped inward by 4 feet and 6 inches or 1.33 meters. Hence, I just needed to move the vertical face representing the podium's facade on the y-axis right where the podium's actual base is, and by measuring the distance between the podium's base projection on the z-axis and the base of the columns, I would get 1.3 meters, which is 3 centimeters off its real counterpart and hence reasonably fine. Once I knew where the ground was, I could start measuring other things as well, like the width of the pilaster base, which is 1.74 meters in my blend file and again off by 3 centimeters with respect to the one on site. Then I imported from the asset browser my own Corinthian column, acting for now just as a placeholder, and I resized it according to its real-world scale. And since I already knew its position on both the z and y axis, what I was left with was defining its correct placement on the x-axis as well, based on the background image. To assess perspective, I then created a plane and aligned it with the entablature at the top. The validation here would come from the presence of a bit of space between the front of the abacus and the lower edge of the entablature. I duplicated the column and moved it on the right again, using the base image as a reference, just to measure from the bottom the interaxial distance between the two columns, which would amount to 3.7 meters in the blend file, again confirming that I'm stuck at a 3 cm delta with respect to the real counterpart, which is indirectly telling me that the setup of my blend file with regards to perspective was apparently fine. Now, the accounts describe the temple as octa-style, which means it has 8 columns front and rear, with 11 columns per each side, which combined with Taylor's assumption that the 3 standing columns are respectively the 3rd, 4th and 5th from north, this would allow me to define the position of the very first and last columns of the eastern side of the temple by using an array modifier on a plane with the offset set at the interaxial distance value. Unfortunately, Taylor's assumption would later prove to be actually wrong, but luckily enough this would still have no impacts on this validation stage. With the complete set of columns represented by these tiny square placeholders, I could finally assess the measures of the stilobat, which goes from column splint to column splint, and that would result in 28 meters for the short edge and 39.1 meters for the long one, which means off by 20 centimeters in the first case and by 50 centimeters in the second case. Now, given as fixed the position of the first column and consider the 3 cm delta in the interaxial distance, for the long edge I would have expected for 10 times the distance the delta to be actually around 30 cm, and for 7 times the distance the delta to be approximately around 20 cm for the short edge. Hence, the latter seems to be fine, while there seems to be a problem with the long one. Actually, they're both wrong. In fact, and this is something I have to admit I didn't know, the distance between columns is not supposed to be fixed across the entire temple. The columns at the corners, in fact, would in general be thicker than the others, so for the intercolumnio to be homogeneous, the interaxial distance needs to be greater. Additionally, the columns at the front would be closer together than those on the sides, apart from the two in the very middle that would be those more far apart in the entire temple, as to provide a far more suggestive entrance into the structure. As such, I started adjusting the positions of the placeholders according to this finding, and the resulting measures of the stilobat will now be 28 meters for the short edge, which is just by chance the same as before, and 39.3 meters for the long edge, so as expected, respectively 20 and 30 centimeters off the real counterpart. The work done in SPy could thus be considered as fairly correct, and I would now feel safe moving on to the actual modeling stage. Whenever I need to model something, I always ask myself what the best workflow would be for that specific occasion, and usually this comes down to two different options. In the first case, my mesh would have a curvature to be smoothed out, while edges would need to be kept instead nice and sharp. The subdiv modifier would indeed take care of the curvature, but at the same time it would also make my edges way too loose. To make them sharp again, I would then need to add support loops, which, non-destructively speaking, means adding a bevel modifier on top of the subdiv modifier. In the second case, there would be no curvature to be smoothed out, and I would actually have the opposite kind of problem, where my edges would be razor sharp as opposed to anything you would see in the real world. The bevel modifier can help again, this time making the edges a bit softer, but without the interpolated information coming from additional subdivisions, the smooth shaded version of the mesh would simply be a complete mess. And that's because the software, when smooth shading, would still take into account all of the normals of the mesh, some of which, if not all, are respectively at very harsh angles. To amend this, we will need to enable the Harden Normals option under the shading palette of the bevel modifier, and within the Object Data Properties tab, we will need to enable Auto Smooth as well. In this way, Blender would leave the big flat faces alone, and it would interpolate when shade smoothing the mesh only among normals comprised within a reasonable angle, where the maximum viable angle would be the one specified by the user. In modeling the temple, I try to rely as much as possible to the second kind of workflow, as it would make the whole scene a lot more efficient and easier to manage. The entire podium is in fact modeled along these lines, as my intention here would be to have full manifold meshes as to replicate the actual blocks a stonemason would have to produce in real life. A couple of tips. The first, technical. If you're using orthographic references to model something, as it is the case here, consider splitting the view into two, where in the first one you can always keep the orthographic view on whatever axis you are working on, while in the second you are free to move around, inspect the mesh, and select whatever vertex, edge or face you may need. The second tip is to consider that this kind of classical profiles are quite never the result of a freestyle exercise by the original architect, but instead they are the result of the combination of different known and widely used base shapes, which do also happen to have a name and to be easily recognizable. So whenever you fall short of references, you can always get your model still look reasonable enough by delving into this kind of profiles primitives. With a section of the podium ready, I would then start looking into the Corinthian column on top of it. Starting from the version I already had, I knew I had to remodel the base from scratch, as the one from the temple of Castor and Pollux is very specific, and to do that I used the reference coming from one of the plates in Taylor's book. The second change was related to the central part of the capital, where the typical volutes would in this case be replaced by interlaced spirals. For this kind of shapes, I always start from the logarithmic spiral under the curved spiral submenu, and then play around with the number of turns as well as the expansion force and the radius. Thickness can be added through the depth control under the bevel subpalette, while to taper a specific point of the curve you can use Alt-S in combination with proportional editing. Back into the main blend file, I used the placeholders from the validation stage to instance all the columns at once. With a very simple geometry node system, I converted each face to a point to then instance the entire column collection at each point. I then proceeded to remove all of the placeholders except for those on the perimeter and in the pronaos, eventually using the transform geometry node in between the collection and the instance on points node to perfect the location of the columns. I would then create a separate collection just for the columns shafts, where I would create a few variations starting from the original one by adding edge loops at uneven distances. All of this to simulate the columns being built upon different blocks or drums of different dimensions and sizes, which in real life would serve the purpose of randomly distributing pivot points as to make the whole structure more resilient in general and to potential natural events specifically, such as earthquakes and the likes. To make the different versions of the shaft spawn randomly at each point, in the GeoNode system I would add a new instance on points node just for them to be then joined back with the original setup. For this system to work, it is enough to tick the separate children and reset children options on the collection info node, as well as the pick instance option in the second instance on points node. I also defined a random seed parameter to drive how the shaft's instances are placed by adding a random value node set on integer with a number of potential values equal to the number of shafts variations, and eventually feeding it into the instance index socket of the instance on points node. Finally, to control the seed of the random value node, I created a group input parameter to be used from outside the node system as to browse among different potential configurations. It was now time to start assembling the podium, and to do that I began staggering copies of the different pieces unevenly as to add another layer of randomness to the composition. This would make the texturing process way more easier later on, and the final outcome much more realistic. If you want to avoid doing that by hand, as I painfully did, I would suggest researching into the accumulate field concept of the geometry nodes ecosystem. But in the end, it is also important to always remember that not everything needs to be procedural after all. To model the corners, especially when using complex profiles, the life-saving option will always be the shear tool, which can be activated on the left of the UI, and 90 degrees corners would correspond to an offset of precisely 1 or -1 depending on the orientation. And from there on, it would be enough to extrude along the new axis, straightening if needed the extremity once again by scaling down to 0 to that specific axis. For the lower podium, I started positioning the pilasters bases at first, leaving the gaps corresponding to where the chambers should be. In general, I also started working on the connection between what will be rendered and the base image, and since the podium is sloped, I knew I needed to model also a part of the inner wall for the future transition to look right. The main idea, anyway, was to try and keep the original remains as much as possible in the final composited image. To complete the podium, I modeled the tabernae as well. The sources seem to suggest, based on the holes found on the different pilasters' bases, the presence of a closing mechanism, either a folding grate or a proper door. For my reconstruction, I decided to go with the latter. To model both the lateral and central flights of stairs, one common way would be to simply use an array modifier with an offset of 1 on either the x and y axis and on the z axis. While still somehow flexible, it can get quite annoying when trying to manipulate either the number of steps or the overall size of the flight all at once. As such, I built my own procedural and much more user-friendly system with just a box to control the size and positioning of the flight and a parameter to define the number of steps comprised within that predefined space. It is quite easy to replicate. You just need a 1x1x1 cube with the origin point at the front bottom left corner, to which you can apply whatever modifier you wish, representing the step, and the same cube without modifiers to be used as the controller. The idea here is simply to instance the steps along the diagonal of the box. Within the GeoNode editor, we will use a curve line where the start and end attributes need to be bound to the corresponding vertices of the controller. To do that, we can sample among the attributes of the controller the respective positions of the two vertices and feed them into the vector sockets of the curve line node. In this way, however we modify the shape and position of the controller, the curve line will simply follow. We need then to convert the curve to points, adding a subdivide curve node in between to control the number of steps instanced. We can then add an instance on points node and bring our step within the node editor, connecting it with the instance socket of the aforementioned node. To get the z dimension of each step right, we can again sample among the position of the vertices belonging to the controller which lie perpendicularly on the z-axis, separate them into their three components and subtracting the respective z values. The result will need to be divided by the number of steps, which in turn will be equal to the number of cuts plus 1. We can then create a new vector with unidimensional sizes for the x and y axis and with the z value being fed by the operation we just did. We can repeat the same process to define the steps dimension also on the y axis and everything is good and fine, but if we join what we did so far back with the controller, we would notice that we have one step more than what we need. To get rid of that, it is enough to store an endpoint boolean value for the curve line with the store named attribute node and to add at the end of the chain a delete geometry node set on instance where the selection would be that very same named attribute. Lastly, we can also link the dimension of the step on the x-axis to that of the controller in the same way we did for both the y and z-axis. At this point, I realized something was wrong. The distance between the last pilaster's base and the lateral flight of stairs was too wide. So either the flight should have been wider, which seems unlikely given that the original remains are still on site, or Taylor's assumption that the three remaining columns were to be the third, fourth and fifth from north is incorrect. Browsing over the plates reported in the second source Occasional Papers of the Nordic Institute in Rome, I came across this representation here, where nothing is really written down, but by judging from the color choice for the columns on the eastern side, it seems to suggest that the three remaining columns are actually the fourth, fifth and sixth from north instead. And this, by the way, seems to be coherent with the remains on site and would definitely solve the mismatch. Hence, I went for that, and even if that's quite a big change at this stage, it is actually never too late to make things right. For the nows, I modeled over one of the plates coming from my sources, and since there are no remains of the original base profile, I combined together some of the common shapes I mentioned when modeling the podium. Again, I stagger several copies of the shapes unevenly, using the shear tool to take care of the corners. The entablature is composed as usual from the architrave and its three fasciae of increasing sizes, the frieze, which is apparently plain in this case, and the cornice. Also in this case, I modeled the different pieces separately, obtaining unsubdivided manifold meshes. Along with that, I focused as well on creating the various ornaments lying on the entablature. For each mesh composing the entablature, I moved the respective origin points to one of the rightmost vertices, and the same I did for whatever ornament would need to be placed on that piece. The idea here was to define a sort of lowest common denominator where the size of the entablature's piece would equal one full pattern of its respective decoration. To manage both at the same time, I created a geometry node system on the entablature with a parameter to control its size on the x-axis. To instance the decoration along the mesh, I used a curve line which would need to run straight across the mesh, and this can be achieved by binding its start and ending point to two consecutive vertices of the entablature's piece using again, as for the flight of stairs, a couple of sample index nodes. To get the right ID for the desired vertices, one practical solution is simply to scroll through the available indices until the curve line is perfectly straight on all of the axes. I would now convert the curve to points with the evaluated option on and add an instance on points node to the chain. I could then import my ornament and connect it to the chain as well. To remove the iteration in excess, I used again a delete geometry node set on instance, into which I would feed the information coming from the stored endpoint selection attribute. I then linked the size of the decoration to that of the entablator's piece so that they would go along together, and I added as well a subdivide curve node right after the curve line node to get control over the number of iterations I wanted to be displayed for that defined space. To make this work, I simply needed to divide the scale of the ornament coming from the entablature by the number of cuts plus 1, or in other terms, by the number of the desired repetitions for the decoration. This is quite a comfortable way to manage repeating patterns along a variable distance, and I started to repeat the same procedure for all of the other pieces of the entablature. Tip to better conform a mesh to curved surfaces is to run an edge loop on the base mesh, isolate the portion of interest and make it a separate object, more specifically a curve, and to use a curve modifier on the deforming mesh to get the right shape. An additional suggestion would be, whenever you need to sample among the vertices of a mesh, to place the geonode system right before any modifier as to work with the least possible amount of information. During the process, it occurred to me that a general rule combining the size of the entablature and the respective number of iterations for the ornaments could be found. In particular, the latter would ideally be equal to the former -1. This means that the operation can be automated either in the geonode system itself or by using drivers. As I chose the second path, I would copy the data path of the length attribute and paste it into a newly created driver for the field driving the number of deco iterations, specifying in the expression the desired relation. I did that for all of the pieces of the entablature, and once done I linked all of the length parameters of the different components to just that of the frieze, as to define a sort of source parameter again using drivers. As such, by toggling just one single attribute, I got a fully procedurally resizable entablature, which came quite handy when working on the final composition. Let me share one additional note for the tiles of the roof. For sure, textures are a great way to save on poly count, but it is questionable whether the normal map would be enough for the magnitude of the shapes involved. Without the need to use displacement or similar techniques, one efficient way to model roof tiles would be to model one single tile and again creating a geometry node system, this time with a grid converted to points, with a point for each face, to then instance the tile with the instance on points node. By manipulating the size on the x and y axis and the respective number of vertices, we can get the whole roof. Moreover, we can add a bit of randomness to it by feeding a random value for the rotation of each single tile, and we can do the same also for the size. By being all instances, the triangles count would still amount to that single tile we modeled at the beginning, which I think, consider how tweakable this system is, results in a quite cost-effective solution. The last step in the modeling process was to create a few ground planes to help with the transition between the render and the base image. With the modeling stage finally completed, it was time for a basic clay render of the temple to be then imported into an image compositing software to produce what will be the three main components of the final output: the base image, the render itself, and a cutout of the base image containing whatever needs to be in front of the render. As such, within Photoshop, with the pen tool, I started creating masks around the pieces of the temple that I wanted to be in front of everything in the final composited image. At this stage, a rough result would be more than enough, as I would refine everything later in the final compositing stage once the full render of the temple would be available. Within Blender, I would add an additional image slot to the current camera as to load the cutout PNG produced in Photoshop. I will also place it in front of the render and with an opacity of 1. This will not only allow me to use the cutout as a direct reference for texturing, but also for some minor modeling adjustments. Since the three columns from the cutout are not obviously casting any shadow, I would isolate the three corresponding model columns into a separate collection, and from the outliner I would toggle the indirect only option on. By enabling this option within the collection containing the three columns, only their indirect impact on the scene, such as shadows and reflections, would be eventually rendered out. The next step was to identify a proper HDRI for the scene, and for that there is no easier way than browsing through the catalog available with the Polyhaven add-on. After a few tests, I decided that the Clofendal Overcast HDRI was a good enough match with the base image. Moving on to actual texturing, the first step was to create a new material and to apply it to the entire model through the Overrides menu. A decent procedural marble material would need to have the following ingredients: a fine grain to drive some basic color variation, more compact patterns to be used for primary marble veins, an additional pattern for some secondary marble veins, a grunge map to be used for generating the orangish stains you would see in references and that are a consequence of the rusting process over time of the minerals which are naturally contained within marble. Additionally, there will be flaking and disintegration coming from changes in the microstructure of the material. Lastly, dirt, of course, and the fact that marble is a translucent material, which means that ideally a marble shader should always have some subsurface scattering going on. All considered, I still contravened some of these rules, as for instance I did not use any subsurface scattering since the final render would be anyway quite blurry and washed out as to match the base image, and due to the fact that at this point in time the temple would already be quite deteriorated as well. The main ally in creating the mentioned patterns is the noise texture node. To make it more interesting, a common trick is to use another noise texture node, and specifically its color output, as vector data in order to displace the original noise texture on a pixel per pixel basis and along different axes all at once. The problem we can see right away is that the texture's pattern is identically repeated among the multiple instances of the model, but we can build a simple node system to amend that. With the random output of the object info node and the random parallelism output of the geometry node, it is in fact possible to randomly offset that texture either among instances or among different pieces within the same mesh. To get full advantage of that, I would combine the two with a simple logical operator and I would enhance the result with a power node. I would then separate the three coordinates of the texture and recombine them using again a logical operator in between, where one of the two variables would be the output of the simple randomization node system. I would finally proceed to apply the first basic color variation by using the output of the noise texture as a mask and by sampling colors from my references. To build more compact patterns which will be used to reproduce marble veinings, I used a duplicated version of the node tree where I reduced the roughness value of the noise texture used as displacement as to make the final pattern less spread apart. With an additional color ramp, I would then isolate some of the ridges of the pattern with the aim to use them as an additional layer of color variation. When doing this kind of manipulations, I usually like to start from very bright colors just to see clearly where the color variation would be eventually applied, and I would then switch to the intended hue only at the end. Additional vein patterns can be created very simply with a Voronoi texture set to distance to edge and with a color ramp with the white pin moved all the way toward the blacks. Also in this case, the trick is to use the color info of a noise texture as to displace the Voronoi, hence producing a quite convincing veining pattern. The suggestion is to avoid over-exaggerating the effect though, as it could easily turn your material into a cheap-looking one. To give the idea of separation and to make the different pieces of the model stand out more, I multiplied on top of the result obtained so far the output of the ambient occlusion node. It was then time to introduce some flaking effect, for which I used a bump node fed again by another variation of the noise system built at the beginning. I then went back to my model to adjust some bevel sizes a bit as to give an even greater idea of separation among shapes, and I applied a grunge texture as well in order to account for the orangish discolorations and stains we mentioned before. At this point, I added a couple of nodes to mimic the tint of the base image, even though I wasn't really trying to color match the render and the base image here, as I would do that in the post-processing stage. I would finally use another grunge map to be used for dirt and general muddiness. An additional tip is to multiply or overlay the output of the coordinates randomization node system on top of everything, as to give each distinct piece of the model a slightly different tint. It was now time to create the different proper materials for the different meshes that would need specific treatment, such as the walls of the cella, for which I imported the normal color variation and ambient occlusion maps coming from a tile material I already had among my Substance Designer projects. Likewise, I created the specific materials to be used for the roof tiles and for the doors of the taberne. To manage the transition between the ground planes and the base image, I built yet again a simple geonode system. From the Botanic add-on, I imported a grass sample and I placed it into its own collection. Then, on the ground plane, I added a distribute points on face node and a subsequent instance on points node. I brought my grass collection in and connected it to the latter, again with the separate and reset children options ticked, just in case I wanted a bit more variation by spawning different grass samples onto the plane. It was then a matter of playing with the density and scale of the instances, as well as with the positioning of the plane and of course with the hue of the material applied to the grass samples. It was finally time for a full render. Here, a low number of samples with the noise turned on would do the trick of washing out a bit the final output. For the final composited image, I would import the final render within Photoshop. And the reason why I did not do the compositing directly within Blender is that I wanted to have full control over the masks used for the cutout and for the different adjustment layers applied. So, my general suggestion would be to always use, when available, the best tool for the task. Right after some basic adjustments with regards to the brightness, contrast and saturation of the render, I proceeded to work on the transitions between the latter, the base image and the cutout by manipulating the masks for both the cutout and of course the ground. To help integrating the render within the background, I used as well some basic dodge and burn techniques, especially trying to match the brightness and tone of those portions of the render which are at direct contact with the ground. In the end, this would be my before and after. One last tip. If you need a wireframe render of your model, you can do the following. Just enable the wireframe option in the overlays menu and switch to the viewport shading mode. Disable whatever images you have applied to your camera and under View, select Viewport Render Image and you're good to go. And that would be it. I hope you discovered something interesting for your future projects. In the meantime, thank you for watching and see you next time.